2,000 subscribers. Alright, I'm a little bit late, but I wasn't going to let this milestone just go by without acknowledging and appreciating your support. First of all, I do just have to take a minute to thank you all for your support. 2020 may not have been a great year for a lot of reasons, but here on YouTube, I've been absolutely blown away by your support. To begin the year with less than 450 subscribers, within half a year surpass 1,000 subscribers, and now to have reached 2,000 all in the same year, thank you doesn't really feel like enough. Just know I truly do appreciate each and every one of you, and thank you for making my 2020 a special one. It really did surpass anything I could have imagined. But to celebrate this milestone and begin the new year, today we're going to be revisiting a game that is my favorite of all time. Dark Souls is a very special game for me. It's one of the few games where I still remember my first playthrough like it was yesterday. Dark Souls beat my ass from pillar to post. I sucked at the game for a long time. My first playthrough took me 60 plus hours. I got stuck on damn near every boss, and in the beginning, yeah, I wanted to give up. But for some reason, I decided to stick around. Yeah, Dark Souls was whooping me for hours and hours, but that feeling of satisfaction and joy when I'd defeat a boss was like no other feeling I'd experienced up until that point. And once you beat one boss, even if the next boss was going to take me some time to figure out, I knew it was possible. This journey of highs and lows, struggles and joys left such an impression on me that I still remember the emotions I felt once I finally saw the credits roll. I had beaten Dark Souls. I was overwhelmed with feelings both joyous and somber. I'd beaten the game. I was proud of myself. In fact, so proud that I was a little sad to see it end. It didn't take long after the credits had finished for me to boot the game back up again, to start the adventure over. I knew what I was doing this time. I'd learned about stats to level up for specific builds. I'd learned the boss patterns and where I was going, and most importantly, I'd learned how to embrace a good, honest challenge. Dark Souls is one of my most played games to this day. I played it for easily over 1,000 hours. After the bug had bitten me, I wanted to do everything this game had to offer. I did magic builds, miracle builds, pyromancy builds, tank builds, glass cannon builds, speed runs, challenge runs, went after all the achievements, maxed out the challenge in New Game Plus, searched for all the lore I could find. I was so obsessed with this game that when I wasn't playing it, I was watching it. Anything to do with it, which is how I found so many of the creators I still watch to this day. I think you get the point though. I love Dark Souls. I mean, I start up a new playthrough at least once a year, and this isn't even my first attempt of making a video about the game.
So, as I said, since it's my B-Day, again, comments please, I need recognition.
Yeah, it was terrible. So this isn't going to be my typical retrospective, where I test to see if my nostalgia is right or wrong, because I still play Dark Souls on a regular basis, and I know I still love it. However, I've also played the game so much that I do recognize its downfalls as well. So let's get started. The story for Dark Souls begins long ago, during a time when dragons ruled the world, a time known as the Age of Ancients. It's in this time where a primordial fire, known as the First Flame, is manifested, which establishes the distinction between life and death, as well as light and dark. Near the First Flame is where four beings find what are known as Lord Souls, which grant an incredible power to each of them. This is where we are introduced to Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, Nito, the first of the undead, the Witch of Izalith, and most mysterious of all, the furtive pygmy. With their newfound powers, they would begin a war against the everlasting dragons and manage to claim victory after the dragons are betrayed by their own, Seath, the Scaleless, and this is where the Age of Fire begins. Over time though, the first flame begins to fade whilst humans rise in power, and fearing the Age of Dark, Gwyn sacrifices himself in order to prolong the flame and the Age of Fire. This is where our story begins. Towards the end of this second Age of Fire, however, humanity is now afflicted with an undead curse, which can be found as a symbol on some people's bodies known as the Dark Sign. Those afflicted with the undead curse continue to resurrect after death, but through succumbing to death too many times, they will eventually lose their minds and go hollow. When we assume the role of the player character, we are a cursed undead who is locked away in an undead asylum. Once we escape the asylum, we are taken away to Lordran and tasked with ringing the bells of awakening. Once we ring both bells, one of two primordial serpents appears, known as Kingseeker Frampt, who informs the player to ascend through Anor Londo, the home of the gods. It's in Anor Londo where Guinevere tells us that we need to succeed Lord Gwyn and fulfill the prophecy, which means beginning another Age of Fire. To do this, we need to acquire all the Lord Souls from the Witch of Izalith, Nito, the Four Kings, and Seath, the Scaleless. But let's rewind for a second. If we don't speak to Frampt and instead, after Anor Londo, head down to the Abyss and defeat the Four Kings, is where we meet Darkstalker Kaith, who tells us to let the fire die out and usher in the Age of Dark instead. Once we acquire all the Lord Souls, we travel to the kiln of the First Flame to battle Gwyn, and when defeated, we are left with two options. Do you link the flame, blindly following the gods, and continue this Age of Fire, or do we see what happens and allow darkness to consume the land? That choice is up to you, but whatever you choose will conclude your story in Dark Souls. This is just the main story in regards to Dark Souls, or at least what you'll experience if you aren't particularly interested in the mass amount of lore to be discovered along the way. What I love about just this objective alone though are tied to the game's two endings. Linking the flame and continuing the Age of Fire seems like what would be considered the good ending, as it's what you're told is for the good of Lordran from multiple characters. But if you manage to find Kaith, it all becomes a bit more unclear what is best. Is linking the flame just in the best interest of the gods? Does it benefit humanity? Does it put an end to this curse? Or is it through the Age of Dark and the gods now losing their power where we will end up better off? It's a question with no real answer, but I find it endlessly interesting to contemplate, which is a big improvement over Demon Souls' main objective, where it's a bit more black and white. But Dark Souls' main goal does what it needs to do. It sets up this world and its backstory very quickly, and through the game's environments and the gameplay is where the atmosphere and general feeling of hopelessness sets in. But a big point of storytelling in the Souls series comes from the game's lore. As I've stated before in my Demon Souls retrospective, I really have grown to love this form of storytelling because it gives players a choice. Don't care about the story? No worries, you don't have to experience all that much and you can just sit back and enjoy the gameplay. You want more story? That's great too. There is a whole heap more you can learn that further expands this world and its backstories. This way of storytelling allows the players to experience as much or as little of the story as they please, and if like myself you are interested in learning more about Lordran, there is such a great risk versus reward balance in regards to acquiring the secret tidbits of information that feel well worth it to go out of your way and find. Now, I'm not going to go over the entirety of the game's lore in this video because Dark Souls really upped the ante in this regard. I mean, how do you think VaatiVidya managed to create so much content? It's hours and hours of stories that others have gone over in greater detail than I ever could. But what I will do is go over my personal favourite, which actually brings me to talking about Dark Souls DLC, Artorias of the Abyss. One of the most intriguing bits of lore in the base game of Dark Souls, in my opinion, is Artorias. Knight Artorias was one of the 4 Knights of Gwyn, a knight revered for his strength of will, and through his exploration in New Londo, discovered the ability of Abyss Walking, which is how he earned his title, Artorias the Abyss Walker. This is all we really learnt about Artorias in the main game through some ring descriptions and lines of dialogue, and it really isn't a lot of information, but it is a great example of a little goes a long way in regards to building up this world's backstory, and it hooked me in. But once we travel back to the land of Ulasil in the DLC, Artorias and his story expands. Defeated by Manus and the Abyss, Artorias sacrifices his only protection in his great shield to protect his loyal companion, a young pup, Sif. This leads to Artorias becoming fully corrupted by the Abyss though, and where us, the player, meets the Great Knight. Through our actions in the DLC, we actually preserve Artorias' honor after besting him in battle, and going on to rescue Sif and Princess Dusk, as our actions are attributed to him. Again, I just think Artorias' story is super compelling and interesting. It ends up involving the player in his story, being able to see and face him after learning essentially how much of a badass he is, and then after the DLC, heading to the Sif fight and getting even just that extra bit of cutscene acknowledging what the player had done. That storyline is just a personal highlight of mine. I love it. Artorias isn't the only highlight, obviously. You have characters like Solaire of Astora, Hawkeye Goth, Big Hat Logan, along with returning characters like the Arse himself Patches, and the Crestfallen Warrior, to name a few. And that's just NPCs, not even mentioning the lore associated with the bosses or locations. I know the Souls series stories may not be everyone's favourite, or something that you may not personally care about, but the many stories to be found or experienced in Dark Souls, if nothing else, just add to the atmosphere and feeling of this world. And if you go out of your way to learn as much as you possibly can about Lordran, you feel like you unlock something that not everyone would have found. And I find that really satisfying. I think what impresses me most about Dark Souls' story though, is the fact that it isn't even the main attraction or the focus, and yet it is still this good. But I think it's time to jump into the meat and potatoes of the Soulsborne series. Let's talk gameplay. As I stated in the Demon Souls video, whilst Dark Souls does make much needed improvements and additions, at its core it's very much the same as before, much like your usual sequel or spiritual successor. You have light and heavy attacks, blocks, parries, ripostes, backstabs mixed in with magic and miracles, and choosing your starting class, whilst beneficial in regards to early leveling, you aren't tied down to any particular class throughout. Dark Souls did add its own additions to the gameplay loop this time around though, with plunging attacks, the ability to jump and slide down ladders, thank god, regenerating health items, a new source of magic in pyromancies, and gone is the MP bar. Now you have a set amount of spells and once you're out, you're out. These don't seem like a whole lot of new additions, but they are much appreciated, especially the ladder slides. Why they were so slow in Demon Souls, I will never know. And this is just in regards to the core gameplay, because the rest of Dark Souls improves leaps and bounds over the foundation set by Demon Souls. There is just more of everything in Dark Souls. More areas to explore, even optional areas. More enemies to learn and face. More bosses to face, and not only that, but actual bosses instead of bosses centered around gimmicks. More weapons, spells, and upgrade paths, more options for the player, and just in general, more of a flow in regards to the world of Lordran. Lordran is one of the biggest improvements from Demon Souls to Dark Souls. Gone are Boletaria's segmented areas. Lordran is one interconnected world and has you exploring through slums and catacombs, sewers and castles, swamps and fortresses, forests and the abyss, to name a few. Not only is there a lot more visual variety in Lordran, but there is also just more locations to visit and explore in general that are all weaved together in a way that makes sense, as you can see where you're going, what's close by, and how you got here all in the same location. This almost makes for a world that feels very Metroidvania-esque, and this all helps the player feel a form of progression just by seeing a new locale. This is a big deal, especially for new players, because Dark Souls, like Demon Souls, can beat you down through its enemies and bosses to a point of feeling stuck. So having a frequent change in scenery, having an area open up and expand, or just adding shortcuts for the player to discover, not only helps stop an all-out stall in progress, but also adds to that feeling of satisfaction that is so important in this series. You see, that feeling of triumph and satisfaction in regards to this series usually gets tied to the bosses, as they're usually the finale of an area. But that feeling of pride and excitement is a culmination of the entire area. It's the journey through the areas that can be at times the more challenging aspect, as you learn about enemy placements, attack patterns, weaknesses tied with any environmental hazards or status effects, and using all this information to ensure you're in the best shape to face the area's boss, or hope you can find a bonfire closer to the boss, and if you're not or don't, then hopefully you can use your new knowledge to make that journey back easier. Each area presents new challenges for the player to overcome, which creates a great concoction of triumph, fear, and in some cases relief, all in the same situation when progressing. Lordran just has such a great flow about it. It really is impressive. But that was all a bit general. So let's talk highlights in the level design, and one that immediately comes to mind is the Undeadburg. One of the first areas you should see, and an area that perfectly illustrates just how connected this world is. Not only is it a great area to teach you basics like parrying and riposting with enemies with simple to learn attack patterns and wind-ups, or finding an item that will help you with the Taurus Demon, a lesson that can apply to bosses or status effects from an area, but it also is a great example of flow. The Undeadburg progresses through to the Undead Parish, which ups the enemy encounters incrementally, giving our first look at how to handle multiple bosses at once, having a shortcut back to the Firelink Shrine, a path to Sen's Fortress, or the Darkroot Garden, giving us our first blacksmith early enough to imply that leveling may not be where you should invest your souls. That's not even it, as you go down to the lower Undeadburg and into the depths, down to Blighttown, and returning all the way back to Firelink Shrine. Again, it's just impressive and a great teaching tool for the basics like combat, leveling, and upgrading. In terms of levels themselves though, I do love the tense and feeling of danger when traversing Sen's Fortress, as you deal with traps and snake people, who are the first big increase in enemy challenge. Anor Londo could make this list just for the reveal alone. Before this point, whilst varied, the locales and atmosphere are dark, dank, and fueled by a feeling of hopelessness. So just seeing the light not only helps up that feeling of progression massively, but gives the player a sense of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. Keep on going, only to beat Anor Londo and potentially break that illusion as it plummets into darkness. The painted world of Ariamis being so unique and different from the jump. The catacombs and New Londo ruins having new mechanics like being unable to attack the ghost without a certain item, or respawning skeletons without divine weapons, or the pitch black nightmare of the Tomb of Giants. I do enjoy most of these areas, to be fair, but these are some of my personal highlights for their own different reasons, and again, it's amazing to see these unique locations flow seamlessly between one another once you defeat the bosses. Once again, the bosses also took a big step forward in Dark Souls. Whether it be the Asylum Demon and that first small taste of thrill when emerging victorious, the Taurus Demon playing similar to the Asylum Demon, but on a tiny arena which is ripe for falling and showing the player that no, the bosses are not the only thing you need to watch out for. The Bell Gargoyles throwing in multiple bosses to face at once, and like the Man-Eaters, you need to try and kill or almost kill one of these bad boys before the other one can get too close and double team you. Quelaag being past a poisonous swamp, so if you don't have any remedies, not only do you have to stay far away from the spider's fire attacks, but watch out for the lava she leaves and watch your health bar. All great fun fights for the early game that to this day, if I'm not on my game or get overly confident, still can get the better of me. But each Souls game has that one fight. One fight where if you can beat them, you can beat the game. In Demon Souls, I'd say Flame Lurker is probably that fight. And in Dark Souls, it has to be Ornstein and Smo. To this day, these two can quite easily handle me. Ornstein being this quick zipping knight and Smo the slow sluggish type, but doing big damage. When you pair the two, not only do you have to keep an eye out on both, which is hard enough at times, but find time to get your hits in simultaneously and figure out who you want to defeat first, because whoever is left becomes a super boss with full health. I personally find Smo much easier to face at the end for the reasons I stated before. Slow, which equals easier to hit. But depending on your skill, your build, or what personal challenge you're attempting, your answer could vary. I will admit Ornstein and Smo is a bit of a jump in challenge compared to the fights before this point, but it is a necessary jump, as after this, the Lord Soul fights don't get any easier. The Four Kings being an intense potential cluster fight in the dark, and they can demolish you. Nito always gives me an uneasy feeling summoning skeletons in the hopes of distracting you, but it's really the one journey back between the bonfire and boss I never want to do again. But my favourite fight is the last one, Lord Gwyn. I used to have his attacks down to a point of parrying and riposting the whole thing, but replaying today he did get me to sweat. He's quick, he does big damage. Depending on your build and how quick you can attack, it's hard to time when to attack or heal, and it's the perfect example of how incredible the soundtrack is. Like Demon Souls, Dark Souls is a very quiet game. I mean, expect to hear a lot of this. But when the soundtrack kicks in, it's when it's needed most, which is the boss fights. You have a heightened sense of pressure already, but once you introduce the oftentimes intense soundtrack into the mix, you do feel a sense of dread, and honestly a bit of a oh feeling in your stomach. But Gwyn's track is very different. It's not aggressive or intense. It's a beautiful piano piece that feels out of place when compared to the rest of the tracks, but it makes sense. You are about to continue in his footsteps or create a new age, and most importantly, you're almost done. It's such a great track to send the player off with, and makes the fight with Gwyn more like a dance than a fight. I love the soundtrack for Dark Souls. The composer Motoi Sakuraba helps create so many emotions with his work in this game, and it shouldn't be understated the importance of these tracks. Unfortunately though, with all the positives I've just gone over, and there will be more, I do have a problem with Dark Souls. Not one that ruins my overall enjoyment, but an issue nonetheless. The first half of Dark Souls is incredible, and the second half doesn't continue on this upward trajectory. Up and including Ornstein and Smough, I seriously have very little to complain about other than the Capra Demon being a little BS. But after you beat Ornstein and Smough, it does feel anticlimactic. There is such a grand reveal for Anor Londo, but once you're done, the game sort of just says, well, head on back. I think the developers even knew this is a little tedious, as this is when you unlock fast travel to make returning to areas more convenient. It feels like Anor Londo should have somehow been one of the final areas, instead of the halfway point, and these expansions to areas you've already visited don't connect back to the world. You just fast travel somewhere else to continue, and that makes it feel like they were rushed for time. A lot of my feelings of disappointment though does come from knowing now I have to make my way through Lost Izalith. You have Ceaseless Discharge, which isn't a great fight, Capra and Taurus demons as standard enemies, a repeat boss for the third time, a rare highlight with the Centipede demon, and then a walk relatively damage-free to the strangest boss in the entire game, the Bed of Chaos. Okay, we all know this boss isn't good. The developers even acknowledge this by saving your progress after death to continue when you return. It feels like a copy-pasted area and has one of the worst bosses in the series. What else can I say? It's just an area I know I'm going to have to just push through, as I'm almost done. Again, the second half of Dark Souls isn't bad. Lost Izalith is close, but it feels lackluster, with highlights feeling fewer and farther between the more I play through the game. But back to the positives, which leads me to the two playthroughs you've been watching interchange as I talk. Yes, I played through Dark Souls twice. First with my standard routine build. Big melee weapon, minimal armor, max roll speed, which is more balanced in terms of challenge, and a sorcery build, which many classify as an easy build. The reason I played through the game twice is to illustrate this main point. You can make Dark Souls as challenging or easy as you want, depending on your build, and not only does this massively increase replayability, but it does open up the game to those of all skill ranges to be able to beat the game however they can or want. Play the game at base level, maybe base weapon level, whatever. Punish yourself if you want, or if you're struggling, don't feel intimidated. You can make it easier on yourself. Once again, magic is very powerful. Depending on the boss, stupidly powerful. I just wanted to bring this option up and show the differences to those of you who haven't played the game and are watching this video, as all you hear about Dark Souls and the series is challenge or difficulty. But you can impact to what degree of challenge you want. Personally, I had a blast with both playthroughs equally, even the sorcery build, despite my experience with the game, meaning I believe I just died from falling. Yes, the bed of chaos counts as falling. Don't be scared to look up build guides if you're new. Don't think Dark Souls is inaccessible. Play the game however you want and enjoy it. Quickly, I do want to talk about the DLC's gameplay. Artorias of the Abyss is an aspect of Dark Souls I have not played nearly as much as the rest of the game, and that is usually because I only kill the Hydra and do all the DLC setup when I play as a sorcerer, but I do love it. I find myself getting confident by the time I visit it every time, as I usually save it for close to last, but this DLC will whoop you. The Sanctuary Guardian, Artorias, Calamite and Manus are great boss fights, with Artorias and Calamite being some of my favorites of the entire game. The location is a look into the Darkroot Garden from years ago, so you feel a sense of familiarity and yet a little lost. The enemies will pose you a lot of trouble if you don't watch your corners. The Abyss has such an out of this world atmosphere, and to be honest, the DLC feels like the next logical location change after Anor Londo, and because of this, it can break up the monotony that the second half of Dark Souls can inflict. Dark Souls is a very important game for me, something I'm sure you've gathered if you've made it this far into the video. Without it, I don't know what sort of gaming taste I may have, or how I'd enjoy playing my games. And so yes, I can admit I may be blinded by memories and nostalgia on this one. At release, I hadn't played anything like it. It was perfect. But now, all these years later, the many hours I've sunk into it, no, it's not perfect, and I do dread playing through certain aspects each and every time I play, but I do love it. I find the story and lore compelling, the gameplay fluent, the world flowing, the bosses mostly amazing. It has its hiccups and certain aspects feel rushed, but I would recommend anyone to give the game a go for themselves. It may not even be your cup of tea, but it is a game I recommend everyone at least try, and it's literally on everything now. Dark Souls is still one of, if not my favorite game ever. That has not changed yet, nor do I think it'll change anytime soon. And for me, it's what I would define as a modern classic.